So while bombs rained down in eastern Ukraine, the EU leaders faced off with Vladimir Putin, trying to broker this ceasefire, which is set to begin on Sunday. That's in 3 days. Weapons must be withdrawn, prisoners must be released, and restrictions must be taken off so Ukrainians can return to some kind of normal life. Angela Merkel calls it a glimmer of hope, but those on the other side say, none of this makes sense. Faith Goldie joining us now because as this deal was being brokered, Ukrainian military spokespeople say that in Minsk, 50 tanks, a number of 40 multiple launch rocket systems were entering Ukraine by Russia.
As well as armored vehicles. So just hours before this deal is announced, we actually have an upping up of their military force in heavy artillery form. But you heard there Putin touch on really the two big headlines to come out of this: ceasefire on the 15th and the drawing down of heavy artillery by the 17th. The issue is, and Alex, I'll be honest with you.
By the way, why 3 days? They have 3 days to get out?
Yeah, basically.
Or 3 days to bomb the hell out of the area?
To bomb the hell out of them and then to stop shooting. Getting out is not until 2 days after that, so technically got 5 days to get out. And that includes the upping up of the extra 50 that they sent in this morning. By my read, this is a one-sided deal that does not favor Ukraine, and I'll tell you why. De facto, they have acknowledged the Russian rebel territorial gains. As we know, there has been heavy fighting, 5,400 people dead, areas like Debaltseve, Kramatorsk, the new hot zones, Mariupol basically already in their possession. The Donetsk airport is acknowledged by this agreement as belonging to the rebels now. Yeah, your eyes are furrowed, and with good reason. Imagine the folks on the ground in Ukraine right now. That is now rebel territory, according to this deal. There are two front lines, if you will. One from the September deal in Minsk, 1.0. And that is the line that the rebel forces now have to treat as a demilitarized zone, about 50 kilometers outward from that. Then there is a new line, several hundreds of kilometers inland, and that is now where the Ukrainian military has to treat as its line, which means that this de facto acknowledges Russian rebel territorial gains. But, you know, there's a glimmer of hope, says Merkel, because of the fact that Ukraine is going to be promised its original international boundaries by the end of 2015. That's good. That means all's going to stay the same by the end of 2015, except for the fact that it is conditional. Yeah. That is not what Ukraine wanted in this. And the conditions are things like they have to have constitutional reform that makes sure that there is decentralization away from Kyiv. Like, hi, there's a robber that comes into your house and all of a sudden he's going to tell you what your house rules are. Like, that is what essentially we have enshrined through this peace deal.
But they've basically moved the boundaries back. So Russia has made all these gains that are now Russian territory, as I'm understanding you. Which means, and I'm going to guess here because we've had a ceasefire in place before, which lasted about 14 seconds. Putin will continue pushing the boundaries. So let's say he does a couple of hundred more miles, takes a couple of other areas. They'll have these meetings again. He'll just keep encroaching. Absolutely. Until it all belongs to him. That's how I'm seeing this.
Well, Alex, I wish that you were at that drawing table because apparently Merkel and Holland, this is completely lost on them. Zaharchenko, who is the rebel leader, said this is the final deal. If there is a violation of the ceasefire, they will put the blame on Ukraine. This is his words. He says, we know it's Ukraine that's going to violate the ceasefire. And from there will be no more peace talks.
Well, what was Poroshenko's response? I mean, he can't possibly look at this as a victory because he's lost all this territory.
What he wanted was an unconditional ceasefire. That's all he wanted. What instead he got was a ceasefire that will likely be violated, sure, but a whole bunch of conditions, not on the ceasefire, but on his own territorial integrity, on his own sovereignty. I mean, this is completely backwards, and it makes you wonder who's bidding Hollande and Merkel actually doing, because let's not forget that the precursor to this peace talk, or I should say ceasefire talk, was her doing her appeasement tour across North America, saying don't send lethal aid to Ukraine. Meanwhile, the White House is trying out this trial balloon. My question is, Alex, I've worked at Sun for the whole duration of this conflict. I remember when the death count was at 400, 500. Now it's 5,400. Yeah. I'm wondering, is there a red line? If so, where is it?
Well, I'd be curious to see the reaction out of the White House on this deal. I can't possibly think that Harper would have agreed or encouraged Angela Merkel during that meeting to accept the new boundaries on behalf of the Ukrainian people.
Absolutely not. And let's remember, this is.
And he'll, of course, be speaking at some point today, but I I will be interested to see the reaction of the NATO.
Absolutely, and let's remember that they're not redrawing maps here, but what they are saying is that the Ukrainian military has to treat the gains made by Russian rebel forces as gains made, period.
Well, then it's all optics.
Exactly.
So they're not going to make a new map, but the map has changed drastically.
Well, they're saying that the map might go back at the end of 2015, so long as Ukraine does X, Y, Z, including talking about decentralizing power. They have to renegotiate what's happening in Donetsk and Luhansk. Well, we already know they already own the airport. I mean, what's Ukraine going to do? All of a sudden seize the rest of Donetsk when they have the airport?
Yeah, so if I'm Putin, who has openly said there is nothing going on, we have no military there, so you're bargaining with a guy who doesn't even admit there's any kind of war happening, you're going to accept this, fully knowing that your limit is really 2016 when Obama's gone. So you've got the flexibility now to seize as much territory as possible. And you also know that the European Union's not going to do anything. Western leaders aren't going to do anything. It's essentially Ukraine is going to continue to collapse.
Absolutely. And the reason why no one is doing...
I'm not trying to be a pessimist, but, I don't know how else to look at this.
It's not like the situation's getting better, right? The forecast is not positive. But the issue why no one will do anything, Alex, is because folks are saying, yeah, we don't want to provoke Putin. Understand, no one is provoking Putin. This is his foreign policy.
Sure.
This is what he has made clear. He is bent on domination of all of eastern Ukraine, and from there, he's got his eyes on the Baltics. His foreign minister told us this over a year ago. They are just executing their plan, and right now, we're not standing in the way of it, despite the fact that it violates every single international custom and convention.
Yeah, and so did any dialogue? I guess if they think they've got a peace deal worked out, I guess no conversation came up about arming Ukraine, because now they don't have to even they don't even have to go there.
Nope.
In other words, Western leaders or European leaders, they've all bought themselves a little bit more time.
A little bit more time until what? Again, Merkel went out of her way to make sure that no arms were on the table, so that way she could put up a good face in front of Putin and say, see, don't worry about it, Obama's not going to start sending guns your way.
Yeah.
And don't forget, now Putin is going to go back to his homeland and trumpet this as his success. You know, the state media message in Russia is NATO Eastern expansion. This is Obama's war. These people are provoking us.
Yeah.
And now it's going to be, see, they've given us concessions. They know that these Ukrainian people want their freedom under Russian rule and the rest of it. And he can go home with that and actually trumpet it. And legally speaking, he could actually have a leg to stand on when it comes to popular opinion.
Yeah, and while these meetings were gone, I mean, a couple of dozen people were killed, both military people, but average civilians.
Mm-hmm. And a few things here. First of all, since the end of February, over 260 people have been killed.
Yeah.
The day before these talks in Minsk occurred, President Poroshenko actually visited one of the hotspots in Kramatorsk, and there's video footage of him walking around in hospitals, in houses, and finding shells. I mean, there is absolutely they're indiscriminate in their shooting. Civilian targets are considered legitimate targets in this war. And let's make no bones about it. This is war in Europe right now. We have to stop pretending that this is some sort of civil conflict of Ukrainian domestic importance. This is Russia invading Ukraine with a kill count now over 5,400, and the international community is essentially aiding and abetting.
And has anybody from the Ukrainian, and I'm just looking, I'm not ignoring, I'm looking to see if there's any reaction from either Obama or Mr. Harper on this deal. We're starting to kind of see, comments coming out from some Ukraine officials, essentially saying, yeah, hope is important, and the agreement gives hope, but it's not nearly enough, and it's not going to pass the smell test. Are we hearing any reaction from the Ukrainian community outside of the political?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people want lethal aid. They understand that any ceasefire is going to be bogus. Any peace talks are going to be bogus. The only way that stuff can be backed up is by basically the Russians looking down a barrel of a gun. Let's remember the fact that at face value, Russia has 3 times the national defense budget. But Yanukovych, that ousted leader, president of Ukraine, he pillaged their national defense. So he sold all of their properties and the rest of it. So they don't have what it takes to go up against not some piddly AKs that are being used by these rebels. We're talking about tanks, even drones, UAVs, and the rest of it. So the Ukrainian people, Alex, I'll give you an example. A dear family friend of mine, he has a slipped in Ukraine. He just received his conscription papers. He has a slipped disc and a wife that's 8 months pregnant. He is now being called to serve, and he will go do it because these people, they love their freedom. freedom. They're all that they have right now because the outside world is not coming to their aid.
No.
So when the Ukrainians, what do they think about this? Well, it's a pretty crappy situation.
Sure, and I suspect that over the next 3 days we'll see a little bit of action, but I don't get the sense that this will go on for much more than a couple of weeks.
What won't go on?
I don't get the sense that the deal will hold any better than the last one.
I'll be surprised if it goes on for 1 week after the ceasefire deal.
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, we'll continue watching this, we'll call it a smoke and mirrors deal.